of it.
Oh, yeah.
Amen.
Depending on who you ask, young can mean two very different things. One of the greatest lines in any debate that I have ever seen, and I wasn't alive when this debate happened, but I've seen the clip. President Reagan was debating against Walter Mondale for the presidency. And the moderator of the debate asked President Reagan something to this effect. He said, "Mr. President, I can remember when John Kennedy was president, and he had to go for hours and days on end without any sleep. And I'm just wondering, Mr. President, at your age, do you think that you have the stamina? Do you think that you should be president at your age?" Well, up on the stage, you had a 73-year-old Ronald Reagan and a 56-year-old Walter Mondale. And in a way that only he could, President Reagan, he kind of grinned just a little bit, and he made this incredible statement. Looking at the 56-year-old Walter Mondale, he said this: "I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." 56 years old. I like that. But really, when it comes down to it, young just depends on who you're talking to. So when I talk about young today, I want to give you a little bit of context from the Bible about what young is. So here's what's happening in the scripture that we'll read today. It says this: meditate upon these things. That's wonderful, but if you'll get me to verse number 12, all right? Get me to verse number 12. There's just one way to the pearly gate. Find me verse 12. I know you can do it. Anyway, it says this. It says, Timothy, Paul, the older preacher, is speaking to the younger preacher, now the pastor at the church of Ephesus. And he says to young Timothy, "Timothy, I want you to understand something. I want you to know something. I want you to recognize something. I want you to be on guard for something." He says, "Timothy, let no man despise thy youth." In other words, Paul had previously been the pastor of the church at Ephesus. And Paul was a 65-year-old man, somewhere around that age at this time in his life. And he writes to Timothy and says, "Timothy, you're now the pastor at the church of Ephesus. But Timothy, there's something I want you to be on guard for. You are a young man." And Timothy, just because of your age, there are going to be some that look down at the work that you're doing. There's going to be some that look down at your leadership, some that look down at your preaching. But I want you, Timothy, to let no man despise thy youth. I don't want you to let anyone look down at you just because you're young. I don't want anyone to look down on you because you're young. Now, here's what I can say today. I can relate to that. Timothy's a young preacher. He's a young pastor following an older pastor. Man, I understand what it is to think about. There's people in this church who have been in this church for more years than I've been alive. There are people in this church that have been saved and walking with Jesus for 3 times. I believe I'm right when I say that. 3 times as long as I have been alive. That can be just a little bit intimidating. To follow 2 preachers like Preacher Wishon, I mean, he's a legend. Preacher Barker, I remember the first time I ever heard Preacher Barker preach, I was 5 or 6 years old. He came and preached at our church, and I thought it was like Moses coming to preach. It was a big deal. Preacher Barker is here. And Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, there are going to be those who look down at your work. They're going to look down at your leadership just because you're young. But Timothy, don't let anyone despise your youth. He says, but be thou an example of the believer. And then he goes on, but here's what I want to say. Timothy, you're young. And so there's going to be some people who naturally look down at you just because you're young. Timothy, just because you're a young pastor, there are going to be some who are going to kind of say, I don't know about what he's saying. I don't know what about he's doing. And honestly, just about every decision I make as the pastor of this church, and I say this, I hope you understand in the right way, I have Preacher Barker on one shoulder and Preacher Wishon on the other. And I wonder, what would Preacher Barker do here? What would Preacher Wishon think about this decision? Why? Because I have so much respect for him. Now, I'm going somewhere with this, so I want you to listen to me. I'm just saying I can relate to Timothy here when they say, don't let anyone despise your youth. You know, I've been the pastor here for coming up on 2 years. That absolutely blows my mind, and I know it blows yours. But here's the truth. As your pastor, how many of you would say, I consider you to be my pastor? Would you hold your hand up if you consider me your pastor? Man, that is wonderful and that's encouraging. And now that I know who you are, we're going to get you all to start tithing, all right? But you consider me to be your pastor. Some of you voted for me as your pastor. Some of you have come since, but you consider me to be your pastor. But if you were going to be honest about it today, when it comes right down to it, you would say, if I was walking by you down the street, you'd say, hey, that's my preacher, that's my pastor. But when you really think about it, you love me, you follow me, you respect me, you're good to me, but there's something in your heart that when you think about Preacher Wishon, you think about him differently than you do me. You've got a different love, a different affection for him. Preacher Barker, when you think about him, man, you love me as your pastor, you love me as your preacher, but you look and you say, man, there's just something different about Preacher Barker. There's something different about the way I feel about him. Yes, I'll follow my pastor, I love my pastor, but when it comes right down to the heart of it, in some ways, I still feel, even after 15 years, like Preacher Wishon's my pastor. Y'all understand what I'm saying? You can say, even after 2 years, in some ways, I still have a love. I respect you, Brother Tim. I love you. But, man, I have something in my heart for Preacher Barker. Can I say this to you? That doesn't bother me a bit. Here's the reason it doesn't bother me. There are things that I want as a young pastor today that I don't have. There are things that I want our church to do today and ways I want God to bless our church today that aren't happening. And the reason is not because God is not good. It's not because we're not laboring and working hard. But here's the simple truth. You feel the way you do about Preacher Wishon because he was there when your babies were born. You feel the way you do about Preacher Barker because, man, he was there on the day that you got saved. You feel the way you do about him because you remember the day when God spoke to your heart and God moved. You remember the day when your baby that they saw at birth and they were able to perform their wedding. You remember those things, and because of that, you grew with them. They say that most churches, listen to this, most pastors and most churches, most pastors, after 5 years, the people will really start thinking of him in their heart as, that's my pastor. Something happens after about 5 years that you say, that's my pastor. You have that love, you have that affection. After about 5 to 7 years, you know what happens in a church? That's when you kind of hit your stride. That's when you kind of hit your sink. And you say, well, preacher, what are you getting at? Here's the problem. most pastors in the United States do not stay any longer than 4 years. And you say, why do they leave? Why don't they stay until the people can really get them in their heart? Why don't they stay till the church can really be blessed and really get to going and really seeing God doing wonderful things? Here's the reason. Because someone is looking down at them. Now, here's the truth, and I want you to hear me, because what I'm saying, I'm not saying to make you feel bad. I'm saying it to go somewhere. There are some of you who have been in church. Let's just see. I want to see this. How many of you have been in church for more than 40 years? Would you put your hand up? You know what that means? You can put your hands down. That means that this 28-year-old pastor, you look at sometimes, and here's how you look at me. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I don't mean it in a wrong way. You look at me and you look down at me. Brother Raymond, Brother Joseph, I want you to come here. I want you to help me. I'm going to demonstrate this. Paul says to Timothy, don't let anyone look down on your youth. But I want to show you something here. Now, these two men are dressed fine today. They're going to come right here, and they're going to stand in front of you. I want you to face each other. All right, facing each other, and I want you to look each other in the eyes. Do you see what's happening right here, right now? They're looking each other in the eyes. Do you see how Brother Raymond's head is angled as he looks Brother Joseph in the eyes? What's he doing? He's doing what? Looking down at him. Here's the truth. Some of you, when I preach, you think, man, I love my pastor. I love my preacher. But you look down just a little bit. It's not because you don't love me. It's not because you don't think God's doing great things here, but you've got all those years of experience that I need to grow to. Just because Joseph is not as big as Brother Raymond today doesn't mean that one day they won't be looking each other in the eyes, does it? It doesn't mean that one day Brother Raymond won't be looking up to Brother Joseph. But here's the point today. Timothy, understand this. There are going to be people who are going to look down at you. You're not going to have the experience that I, as a 64-year-old, 65-year-old, that was really specific, somewhere around 65-year-old Apostle Paul has. You're not going to have fought the battles that I fought. They're going to look down at you, Timothy, but don't let them look down on you. See, here's the difference. When you look at me and you say, preacher, I have sat under some of the greatest preachers who've ever lived, that doesn't bother me. When you say, preacher, I've sat down under some of the greatest pastors who've ever lived, and preacher, here's what needs to happen. I'm looking at you and I have to look down at you. You know what the answer to that is? It's not for Joseph to say, well, if you're going to look down at me, I'm just going to take my toys and go home. No. Well, if you're going to look down at me and you're not going to treat me as your equal, you're not going to treat me at the same level as you, I'm just going to give up and I'm going to go home. You know what the answer for Joseph is? If he's looking down at you, grow up. There's people in this church who say, Preacher Tim, we love you. Thank y'all. That helps me. Preacher Tim, we love you. But Preacher Tim, I got to be honest with you. You don't have the experience that Preacher Barker did, having preached for 50 years. You know what I say to you? You're right. And I'm okay with that. You say, Brother Tim, I love you, I appreciate you, but you haven't been there with my family in the hospital in the middle of the night like Preacher Wishon has been. And Brother Tim, I love you, I care about you, but you haven't performed my kids' weddings. What are you going to do about that? Well, here's what I'm going to do. Well, you better call me illustrious potentate. You better call me Reverend Webb. You better treat me like I'm somebody, or I'm taking my toys and I'm going home. Well, no, that's not the answer. You know what the answer is when somebody's looking down at you? Grow up. There's things I want to see happen here in this church, but unless God were to intervene in some miraculous way, and by the way, He can do that, but there's things that it's going to take time. There's things that it's going to take years of growing together and trusting one another. Here's what Paul says to Timothy. Timothy, don't let anyone look down on you. Timothy, you're young. You're inexperienced. You haven't been through all the battles that I've been through. You haven't fought all the fights that I've had to fight. You haven't learned everything that I've learned. But Timothy, even when folks are looking down at you, it is your choice. Now, this is worth everything you paid to get in here this morning. When folks are looking down at you, it's still your choice whether they will look down on you. Now, listen, if I have to, I will get Miss Karen up here on the organ, and she'll wow on the organ to get y'all to shout, all right? Hear what I just said. Folks may look down at you, but it is your choice whether they look down on you. Well, let me help you here. Timothy, they're going to despise you just because you're young. You know what every generation does with the generation that comes after them? They are the worst generation I've ever seen. I was reading on it this week, studying on it. I don't have time to talk about it this morning, and I promise you I'm preaching from the Bible. Let no man despise thy youth. But I was reading on it all the way back to Socrates, all the way back in ancient Greek. He was writing about how terrible and lazy and low down the next generation was. And you know what it sounded like? Just like people today who will make statements like this. This next generation ain't nothing but a bunch of snowflakes. None of them will work. None of them have any respect. Amen. That's right. You tell it, brother. They don't have any respect. They don't work. They don't care. They think everything should be handed to them on a silver platter. And here's the truth. We've been saying that for generation after generation. Now, I will admit, in some ways it's worse today than other times. I understand that. But here's what I want to say to you. Those of you who will say, well, they're nothing but a bunch of snowflakes. You raised them. They're nothing but a bunch of snowflakes. Well, I'll tell you this, if enough snowflakes get together, they can shut down a city. Yeah. And Paul says, Timothy, they're going to look down at you just because you're younger. They're going to look down at you just because you don't know some things. And Timothy, if you want to, you can say, you know what? I'm taking my toys and I'm going home to mama. I'm not going to play with y'all anymore because you're looking down at me. Or Timothy, you can do this. You can say, you know what? Look down at me. That's okay. There's some areas where I need to grow. There's some areas where everything is not as it should be, but I'm going to grow up. And as I'm growing, you can look down at me, but it's my choice if you're going to look down on me. It's up to me. He says, Timothy, let no man despise thy youth. Can I say this to the kids who are sitting up in the balcony? Don't let anyone look down on you because you're a kid. Can I say this to the teenagers who are sitting here on the main floor? Don't let anyone look down at you because you're a teenager. Can I say this to the young married couples and the young singles here on the main floor? Don't let anyone look down at you just because you're young. You say, well, how old was Brother Timothy here? How old is this young man by the name of Timothy? Well, that word youth there means this, 40 and under. I want everyone right now who is 40 years old and under to stand up just for a minute. I want you to do that. 40 years old and under, I want you to stand up. Now, some of y'all are lying. Here's the truth, though. Can I talk to y'all for just a minute? There are people who look at you and say, because you're young, you're lazy. Because you're young, you're not a real Christian. Because you're young, you don't love the old-time way. You don't love the things of God, and God is never going to do anything with you. And what they're doing is looking down at you, but here's the truth. They can look down at you, but it is your choice whether they're going to look down on you. Because of where you were born or what your last name is, there may be some people who are looking down at you. There may be some people because of where you work or where you're at in your career, they look down at you. But here's the truth. Whether they look down at you or not, that's not your choice. That's not in your control. What other folks do, that's really not up to you. But here's the truth. You can let them look down at you, but that does not mean they get to look down on you. You can be seated. When I was in high school, I felt like adults didn't take me seriously. Felt like nobody listens to me. Nobody can see how brilliant I really am. Nobody can understand how much understanding I have about this world, and they're looking down at me. So you know what I said? Here's what I'm going to do. Mom and Daddy look down at me like I don't know anything, and you know what I found out about 10 years later? I didn't know diddly squat. But Mom and Daddy are looking down at me because, you know, I'm young, so here's what I'm going to do. To make sure no one looks down at me ever again, I'm going to go get a job. You know what I found out when I walked through the door? Somebody looked at me and said, you're going to learn something today. Your world is about to change. And you know what I found out when I got in there? There were people who were looking down at me. There were people there who were younger than me who were looking down at me. Why? Because they had more experience there. So then I said, all right, here's what I'll do. I'll graduate high school. And man, on the night that I graduated high school, I gave the valedictory address. Thank you, Brother Monty. I appreciate that. There was 8 of us in the class, but that's beside the point. I gave the valedictory address, and the girl that gave the that address, what is it? Salutatory. She gave the salutatory address. She did a good job. We still see her from time to time, but she talked about how wonderful our class was and how we were going to change the world, and everybody came by and they gave us cards and told us how awesome we were and what a great accomplishment it was, and we were going out into the world now, and we felt like big stuff. And then we got to college. And you know what they did? Look down at us. We weren't the big show anymore. We weren't the big deal anymore. And somebody was looking down and saying, you're getting ready to learn something here. Here's what I'm saying to you. At every stage of your life, some of you who are teenagers feel like, as soon as I get out of the house, then I'm going to have respect. There's not going to be anybody looking down at me. There's not going to be anybody who knows more than me. There's not going to be anybody who can tell me what to do and tell me how to behave. I've got bad news for you. I thought, as soon as I get married, then nobody will ever look down at me again. Now, that wasn't the way, I didn't mean she looks down at me, all right? Nobody will ever look down at me again. And I thought, this is how you get respect. This is how you get people to look at you as an equal. And you know what they all came by and said? You're getting married? You're going to learn something now, boy. You're getting married? You ain't seen nothing yet. And you know what they did? They looked down at me. And so then I became a pastor of a church, and I thought, all right, this is it. Now they're going to look me eyeball to eyeball, and I'm going to be their equal. And you know what I found out? There's a lot of preachers who've been at this a lot longer than I have. There's a lot of preachers who've been more blessed than I have. And you know what? They come by and say, oh, man, you got voted in over at Northwood? You're going to learn something now. You know what they were doing? They weren't necessarily looking down on me. They weren't saying, you're never going to do anything, you're never going to be anything, but they were saying, you've got some things to learn. And now, okay, now y'all are all going to look at me as an equal because I'm getting ready to be a dad. I am a dad. And you know what I keep hearing from all of you? You ain't seen nothing yet. You're getting ready to learn something, and you know what you're doing? You're looking down at me. And you know what I could do then? I can say, well, if y'all want to be that way, we're not going to take any of your presents. We're not going to take any of your nice comments. We're not going to take any of your nice advice because no one's going to look down at us because we know everything. Here's the truth, though. When it comes to being a mama, she's going to be awesome. She's going to be wonderful. But when it comes to being a daddy, there's some things I'm going to have to learn. There's some things I'm going to have to grow in. And there's going to be folks who come by when the kid is crying at church on Sunday morning, and they're going to say, you're the pastor. Your kids aren't supposed to cry. And they're going to look down. But here's the truth. It's my choice whether I let them look down on me. Timothy, they're going to look down at you because you're young. They're going to look down at you because of where you were born. They're going to look down at you because you come from a mixed race home and a broken home. Timothy, they're going to look down at you because of your inexperience. But Timothy, if you'll listen to me, I'll help you. Just because they look down at you doesn't mean they get to look down on you. See, that's your choice, Timothy. Now I'm a daddy, and I'm kind of to that stage of life where some of y'all were just a few years ago, and you thought, I'll become a parent. Then they'll look me in the eye. You know what you found out? There were those who said, you'll learn something when your kids get to college. You'll learn something when they get out of the house. You'll learn something when they become a grandparent. When you become a grandparent, here's what I'm saying to you. There's always going to be somebody ahead of you. Always going to be somebody who knows more. Always going to be somebody who's seen more. And they're always going to be looking down at you. Some of you sitting here this morning, you say, well, preacher, I finished high school. Preacher, I have got married, I've become a daddy, I have worked, I've retired, I've seen it all, I've done it all, I know it all, and there's no one looking down at me. Can I tell you the truth? You're probably right. Some of your friends are wondering if you're even going to make it to heaven because you've lived so long. They're up there wondering, are they ever coming? Did they go the other way? But here's the truth. Just about the time that you've seen it all, you know it all, and you've done it all, what starts happening? Things that you used to be able to get to come to you just like this, it escapes you. Names that used to just roll off your tongue, now you have to stand there for a minute and say, I know your face, I know your name as good as I know my name, but I can't think of it. Just when you get to the top and say, now nobody's going to look down at me, all of a sudden you find that your body's not functioning the way that it once did. and you literally find yourself having to look up at someone and say, can you help me? Can you help me function? Can you help me live a normal life? Here's my point in saying everything I just said. How people look at you, that's their business. You cannot do a solitary thing about that. But Timothy, just because people are looking down at you doesn't mean they get to look down on you. Timothy, here's what you need to do. Let no man despise thy youth. Here's the message today, if you hadn't got it already. It's simply this. They may look down at you, but it's your choice whether they look down on you. They may look down at you, but it's your choice whether they look down on you. And listen to this. Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, you're a young pastor. You're a young man. Timothy, you're only 35 years old, and in the grand scheme of things, you're a young boy. Other night, Brother Jerry and Miss Charlotte, we were at church, and they wanted to introduce me to somebody, and it was a family member of theirs, and I walked up to her, and they said, this is our pastor. Man, they acted like they were proud of me, and boy, I felt good about that, and they said, this is our pastor. And she said, Lord, honey, when she pointed at you a while ago, I thought, that's a baby, not a pastor. What is it? It's somebody looking down at me. Here's the truth Timothy gives to Paul, or Paul gives to Timothy. They will look down at you because you're young. Can I say this to you? They may look down at you because you don't know as much. They may look down at you because you don't have as much. They may look down at you because of who your mom and your dad are, and they may look down at you because of where you live, and they may look down at you because of all these different reasons. But Timothy, here's what you need to do. Be the exception. Be an example. He says, Timothy, let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers. Children sitting in the balcony today, you don't want anybody to call you a kid. You don't want anybody to call you a child. But here's what the Bible says. Even a child is known by his doings. Can I say to every adult sitting in this room today, you are known by the life that you lead and the decisions that you make. And Paul says to Timothy, son, if you'll listen to me, I'll help you right here. The rule is that everybody that grows up on that side of the tracks is lazy and a scoundrel and will not work a day in their lives. And that's what folks are going to think about you, Timothy. The rule is that anyone who's born in your generation doesn't know how to look up from their cell phone and carry on a conversation with another human being. But Timothy, that doesn't have to be you. The rule is that because you're young, you don't care and you're just wasting the years and you're just letting them blow by. The rule is because your children are young, you don't know anything and you don't care and you won't work with them. And one day you'll be an old man and you'll be an old woman looking back with regret and wishing you could have those years back. That's the rule. But Timothy, you don't have to be the rule. Be thou an example of the believers. I'm getting ready to say what I'm getting ready to say, and I believe with all my heart. There can be children sitting in that balcony this morning who can be a better Christian than the preacher on this platform. There can be boys and girls who come from the wrong side of the tracks. You say, preacher, they don't come from the wrong side of the tracks. You're right. There's no tracks in Yankton County. But preacher, they come from the wrong side of the tracks, but that does not mean for a moment they can't be the best Christian in this room. You might be a mom or a dad who's sitting here today and you really didn't have a mom or a dad who raised you and taught you and helped you in the way that you ought to go, but now you've got your own children. And so the rule is that you're going to ruin and you're going to wreck your children. But here's the truth. You can be an exception to the rule and you can be a parent who brings honor and glory to God. Timothy, if you'll listen to me, I'll help you. They may look down at you, but you choose whether they get to look down on you. I'm trying to be simple today. I'm trying to help you. Yesterday, man, there was a pile of people here working yesterday, and I appreciate every one of you who came out. I'm going to be honest with you. Y'all won't never figure this out just looking at me. I can handle a chainsaw okay. When it comes to the trees in the woods, I can look at them and I can say, yeah, that's a tree, but I probably can't tell you what kind of tree. When it comes to the tractors and when it comes to the wood splitters and all that, I can help you, I can do my part, but honestly, if we were going to compare knowledge on it, you would look at me and say, you got some room to grow, son. You got some things you don't know. Brother, where's Brother David at? Where's Brother David? Hey, there's Brother David. Yesterday, he was on his Bobcat. He was running up through the woods, and Brother Bob had left his tractor sitting there, and it was in the way of Brother David getting out. And Brother David hollered at me and said, hey, move that tractor. And I looked at that high-dollar tractor. I looked at that fine tractor, and I said, there's no way I'm touching that thing and messing it up, because I didn't know anything about that tractor. You know what Brother David could do at that moment? Here's what he did. He got off of his Bobcat. He walked over there. He said, preacher, here's how you do it next time. If you'll do this and this, you can move this tractor, no problem. You know what I could have done at that moment? While Brother David was looking at me this way, I could have said, well, if I don't know about the tractor, I'm just going to go back to the house and y'all can work. If I'm not the best chainsawer here, I'll just go back to the house and y'all can work, because you're looking down at me. If I'm not the best wood splitter here, you're looking down at me, I'm going back to the house. But you know what I said instead? I said, I don't know much about that tractor. I don't know much about that chainsaw. I can't tell you which one of these logs is going to get you a whole lot of money and which one of these logs isn't worth a hill of beans. But I do know this. You can look down at me if you want to. You can say you've got room to grow if you want to. But here's what you won't be able to say about me. You won't be able to say I was lazy and didn't work. Amen. It's all in how you look at it. Well, I didn't have a daddy who sat down and read the Bible with me. Could you do it for your children? I never had someone to be an example to me. Neither did Timothy. His father was most likely a pagan. And no doubt through Timothy's life, he was looked down at because he came from a marriage of two different nationalities, two different religions. No doubt he had a hard way coming up. Timothy may not have had the best example in his father, but Paul said, Timothy, if you will listen to me, I'm going to help you. They can look down at you all they want to, but if they look down on you, that's up to you. Because Timothy, here's the deal. You are young. There's nothing you can do about that. I'm 28 years old, whether I like it or not. I'm 28 years old, whether you like it or not. But God's called me to be the pastor of this church, and I will tell you this. An 18-year-old me is very different than a 28-year-old me. And Lord willing, 30 years from now, a 58-year-old me is going to be very different than a 28-year-old me. I hope in that time I will have grown, but here's the truth. I can't do a thing about where I'm at right now. I can't make up the years that Preacher Wishon had with you. I just can't do it right now. I can't make up the years that Preacher Barker had with you. I can't do it right now. Timothy could not know what Paul knew. He could not have gone where Paul had gone. But here's what Paul said to him, son, if you'll just stay at it, if you'll just stick with it, if you'll just grow, one day you'll be looking them in the eye, and one day you'll look back and say, thank God I didn't just sit and sour, but I chose to be an example. Here's the final point, and I'm done. If you've got the notes for today, this is the first point, but it's the final point for this service. They can look down at you, but it's your choice if they look down on you. Timothy, you may have not had the best example, but you can be an example. Timothy, when it comes to word, Timothy, in the way you talk, you can be an example to someone else. Can I say this to the young people in this room today? You don't have to talk like a bum. You don't have to say, well, you know what, I can say. Listen, there are certain words that I don't say, not because they're cuss words, not because there's a Bible verse that says not to say them, but just because I want to be an example in how I talk. He says, you be an example in word. Can I give you something real practical? He's talking about the way you talk. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. There's sometimes that we think as young people, we think that, well, the only way that I can be respected is if I'm just hard-nosed and hard-edged and I'm real. I can about regurgitate when I hear somebody say, we just want to be authentic. You know what that means? Nothing. We just want to be real. You know what that means? Nothing. If it means anything, it usually means this. I want to be rude and I want to be crass and I don't want you to say anything about it. He says, you be an example in word. Young people, can I encourage you? Talk to adults like they matter. If you're a young man or a young woman, and this isn't all that text is talking about, please know it's not, but if you're a young man and you're a young woman and someone looks at you and says, how are you today? And you look back at them, you stick your hand out to shake their hand, you look them in the eye, and you say, sir, I'm doing fine, how are you today? You know what will happen to them? They'll fall over from a heart attack. But you say, well, preacher, yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, that's old fogey stuff. That's old folks stuff. They look down at me anyway, so I might as well just talk how I want to. Well, if that's your attitude, that's fine. But let me tell you something. You know who has all the money? It's those old fogies. You know who has the job that you're looking to get in a few years? It's those old fogies. You know, boys, who has the daughters that you're wanting to marry in a few years? It's those old men. And you know what they're looking for? They're looking for somebody who goes just a step above their expectation. They just want somebody who will treat their girl decent. And if you'll, instead of honking the horn when you get to the house, you'll go and knock on the door. You know what that daddy says? I thought a bum was coming to pick up my girl. But there's an example here. Hey, boys, come here. See how this boy treats your sister? That's the way y'all need to act. Hey, son, did your daddy teach you that? No, sir, my daddy's in jail. But I just decided somewhere back there that whether they look down at me or not, they're not going to look down on me. I just decided I'm going to be an example in word, whether they take me seriously, whether they look at me and they don't act like I matter or not. I'm going to act, here's what my dad used to say, I'm going to act like somebody. Timothy, you're young. There's going to be people that look down at you. That's just reality. But whether they look down on you or not, that's up to you. You can be an exception to the rules. Can I tell you this, young people? The standard is so low right now. The expectations that people have are so low right now that if you'll just take a step up, just a single step up, they'll look and say, that's an exemplary young man. That's an exemplary young woman. They go beyond the expectations. Timothy, you want to get their respect, you want to get their eyes lifted above your age, then act like somebody. Be an example in word. Be an example in conversation. There's no reason that the teenagers of this church, and by the way, I'm thankful for every young person in this church. I'm thankful for every young married couple. I'm thankful for every child in this church. I'm thankful for everyone. And if you've come here today to tell me how awful the next generation is, and tell me how sorry the next generation is, and tell me that God can't do anything with the next generation, I have a real deep theological truth I'd like to share with you. I believe in this next generation. I believe that there's no reason that kids in that balcony and teenagers on this floor couldn't be such Christians that at their workplace they say, you know what, there's somebody I'd like my son to be like. There's somebody I'd like my daughter to be like. Not just in church, but in conversation. That's in every single area of your life. Be distinct, be different, be exceptional. He said in conversation, in word, in charity. You know what that means? Love. That means not always looking to get somebody under your feet, get somebody under you, get one over on somebody, but looking at somebody and saying, how can I help them? How can I bless them? Not looking at how can I get ahead, but looking and saying, because Christ loved me, I ought to love them. Maybe dad didn't love me like he should have. Maybe mom didn't treat me like she should have. Maybe I didn't get the love that I craved, but there's no reason while others are looking down at me that I can't square my shoulders and by God's grace and God's help be an example to someone else of someone who loves. He says in love and in spirit. You know what? The most excited Christians in this church, you know who they ought to be? Ought to be the old people. And you say, well, who's the old people? I don't know who you are. You know who you are. I'm not going to point you out for anything. But you know who ought to be the most excited about being a Christian? It's the ones who've been walking with Jesus for years and years and years and seen what God has done for them over and over and time again. But you know most of the time who the most excited Christians are? It's little boys and girls that come out of Sunday school and they've got their little Sunday school paper and they run home and they say, Mama, Mama, did you know that Jesus loves us? Oh my goodness, Mama, did you know Jesus died on the cross for us? Why? Because they haven't got jaded to it. They haven't got old to it. And Paul says to Timothy, Timothy, in your spirit, be fervent, be excited, be the kind of Christian that makes Jesus look good. Be excited. Listen, you can look down on the next generation if you want to, but you know who God has used so many times to bring revival to a nation? It's been that next generation that the world was looking down at and saying, there's no hope for them. That next generation, they're nothing but a bunch of drunks. They're nothing but a bunch of adulterers. They're nothing but a bunch of man-haters. They're nothing, and God will never do anything with them. And God will start to stir around in those embers, and some young person will get on fire, and it's not long before that young person's fiery spirit catches with some old person's fiery spirit, and God sends a revival to the nation. Can I remind you the reason that the church was used so greatly in the early days was because God empowered the disciples. You know who the disciples are, don't you? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You know how old they probably were? The Bible doesn't tell us. But there's some things we can put together from it. Peter was the only one of the disciples who was married. Now, back in those days, they didn't wait till they were 35, 40 years old to get married. They married young. Peter was the only one who was married. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us a few things. Number one, the rest of them, they were probably young. But number two, there's this about them. They were young enough that they could go follow a rabbi. You say, what's that got to do with the price of rice in Spain? Well, here it is. If they were established in their careers, they were established in their families, they couldn't just take off the countryside following this Messiah. They couldn't just take off following Jesus. But these young men who didn't have established homes, who didn't have established families, whose careers they could look at their dad and say, Dad, we're leaving the fishing boats, we're leaving the business with you, we're forsaking all and following Jesus. Who was it that did that? Here's what most Bible scholars believe. The disciples were most likely teenagers to early 20s at the most. And you know who absolutely turned the world upside down? Unlearned and ignorant fishermen. You can look at the next generation and say, oh, there's nothing to them. They come from the wrong side of the tracks. They don't have any manners. They don't have any care. They don't have any understanding. They don't have any respect for the house of God. They kick on the back of the pews during church. They draw in the psalm books during church. God's never going to do anything with them. And you can look down at them if you want to, but I believe there's a generation that's going to say this. Look down at me if you want to, but I've just made my choice. I'm going to be on fire for God. I'm going to go with God, and I believe God's going to do something through me. Young person, I'm just telling you today, the choice is yours. He says, be fervent in your spirit. Be fervent in your faith. Man, trust God, believe God, know what you believe and why you believe it. And then in your purity. This world is a cesspool of wickedness. And honestly, the world's expectation of you is this, that you're going to live a life where anything goes. You're going to live a life where you really don't care about honoring God with your body. You're going to live a life where you go from one person to the next, get what you can, and go on to the next. And here's the truth. If you'll just take a step above that, if you'll just say, God, they can look down at me and think what they want to about me. God, they can look at me and say, you're going to learn and you're going to grow, and God, they're right. I do need to learn. I do need to grow. But God, in this area of purity, I've made up my mind. I'm going to honor you with my body. I'm going to be an example to those who are around me. I'm going to honor you with my spirit. I'm going to be an example to others because, God, I believe that the choice is mine. Here's the message today. By God's grace, exceed their expectations. By God's grace, rise up and be the greatest generation. Rise up and be those who would walk with God. I'm talking to 30-somethings, and I'm talking to 40-somethings, and I'm talking to teenagers and young men and young women. And I'm just saying to you today, by God's grace, say, you know what? Look at me how you want to, but I am going to square my shoulders by the grace and the help of God, and I'm going to exceed your expectations. I'm going to do more for God's glory. And I'm just telling you, Timothy, you're young. Not a thing in the world you can do about that. Someone asked the question, and it's a good question. I'm going to, Lord willing, address it. I've been telling you to write down your questions for that series on Ask Anything from the Bible. And someone asked this question, and it's a good question. I will address it. But the question was basically this: why don't preachers preach from this certain part of the Bible? Why don't preachers preach from this certain book of the Bible? And I'd like to give my answer to that person today. Give me some time. You know, I want to preach every single verse of the Bible to you every single Sunday morning, and you know I do as long as I take at it. But I can't do it. I can't give you every truth from the Word of God. I can't give you, listen, I can't stand up here today and say, here's how you have a perfect home, a perfect marriage, and perfect kids. I can't do that. I've not been there. I've not lived that. But I can say this: give me some time. Give me some time, and we'll get to that book you're asking about. You know what? Right now you're saying, preacher, you don't have all the experience. And I want to say with you, amen and hallelujah. But give me some time. Hey, young person, they might look at you today and say, you sure don't know a lot of the Bible. Look back at them and say, just give me some time. Hey, young person, your family isn't much, your name isn't much, and I really don't know what to think about you. That's all right. Just give me some time. Just let me grow. Give me some years, and I will exceed your expectations by God's grace. Can I say to the people who are sitting here today who you wouldn't consider yourself to be a youth, you look back and you see a lot of wasted years, and you say, man, I missed it. I wrecked it. Can I tell you, there's still somebody looking at you today, and you can be an example to them. There's some boys and girls sitting up in that balcony today who need somebody to teach their Sunday school class. You say, preacher, I can't teach that class. Preacher, I've made a mess of my life. Preacher, I've done things I'm not proud of. I've not been pure. I've not been fervent in spirit. My words, my conversation, it hasn't been everything that it ought to be. Would you care enough about the next generation to say, listen, I'm not perfect, but I want to help you? Would you care about the next generation enough to say, you know what? I have to look down at you in some areas. There's a lot of things you don't know. Young people, can I tell you, the adults in your life that look down at you, it's not because they think you're foolish. Book of Proverbs talks about three kinds of people. It talks about the wise. You know who those are? Those are the ones who've applied knowledge to their life. They've learned some things, and they've put it into practice. There's another group of people called the fools. The fools are the ones who have heard knowledge, they've heard the truth, and they've rejected it. But then there's a third group of people, and those are the simple. You say, well, who are the simple? Those are the ones who just haven't been exposed to the knowledge yet. They haven't been exposed to the truth yet. They've not embraced it. They've not rejected it. They just don't know about it yet. Can I say this to you, young people? I'm including myself in this. There's some things that we don't know because we just don't know. We don't even know the questions to ask in some ways. We haven't had some experiences in life. And these people that are above us that are looking down at you, they're not looking down at you trying to harm you. They're just saying, listen, you don't know any better yet, but I'm trying to keep you from some foolish decisions that I've made. Or listen, you don't know any better yet. You don't understand any better yet. But I want to give you some knowledge that's helped me. I want you to see how God has blessed me. And I'm just saying today, there's no excuse. God can use any person in this room, old person, young person, middle-aged, senior citizen. God has something for every one of us to do. The question is, are we going to do it? The question is, are we going to say, by God's grace, I want to be an example? I know what the expectation is, but I don't want to just meet the expectation. I don't want to just do the bare minimum. I want to exceed, by God's grace, the expectations that this world has of me. And I want to see God do something great. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed.